You wake up, and the first thing you notice is nothing. Not sadness, not anxiety, just a vast emptiness where feelings used to be. You go through the motions, shower, coffee, commute, work, but it's like watching someone else live your life through a thick pane of glass. You're there, but you're not really there. You can see people laughing around you, getting excited, getting upset, having emotional reactions to things, and you wonder, when did I stop being able to do that? When did everything become so muted, so distant, so fundamentally meaningless? It's not that you want to feel sad or anxious, it's that you want to feel anything at all. But there's just this void, this emotional flatness that makes every experience feel the same. Whether something good happens or something bad happens, your internal response is identical. Nothing moves you, nothing touches you, nothing reaches that place inside where feelings are supposed to live. And the worst part is that you can't even explain it properly to others. How do you tell someone, "I can't feel anything," when they respond with, "What do you mean? You look fine, you're functioning, you're going to work, paying your bills, maintaining relationships from the outside. Everything appears normal, but inside, there's just this terrifying numbness, this sense that the part of you that makes you human has somehow gone offline, and you don't know if it's ever coming back." This is not depression in the traditional sense. It's something more subtle, more insidious. It's what psychologists call emotional anesthesia, the psychological numbing that happens when your mind decides that feeling is too dangerous, too painful, too overwhelming, so it shuts down the entire system, like a circuit breaker that trips to prevent the house from burning down. But now you're living in darkness, and you've forgotten what light feels like. If you try to trace it back to pinpoint the exact moment when you stopped feeling, you probably can't. It didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, so subtle that you didn't notice until one day you realized you'd been going through life on autopilot for months, maybe years. Maybe it started with small things. You stopped getting excited about things. You used to love that hobby that used to consume your thoughts, now feels like a chore. That friend who used to make you laugh now feels exhausting. To be around that goal you were working toward now seems pointless. You told yourself you were just tired, just stressed, just going through a phase. Everyone has ups and downs, right? But the downs kept getting longer, and the ups became shorter, until eventually there were no ups anymore, just a flat, monotonous middle ground where nothing felt good, but nothing felt particularly bad either, just nothing. And here's what's terrifying about emotional numbness. Its sneaky depression announces itself with tears, with darkness, with obvious suffering. But numbness disguises itself as normalcy, as calm, as being fine. You're not crying, you're not breaking down, you're not having panic attacks. So everyone, including yourself, assumes you're okay, but you're not okay. You're just so disconnected from your own emotional system that you can't even access the distress signals anymore. It's like your fire alarm has stopped working, not because there's no fire, but because the alarm itself has short-circuited. David knew this feeling intimately. He was 32 years old, worked in IT, had a stable job, a decent apartment, a girlfriend who loved him on paper. His life was fine, but inside he felt like an empty shell going through the motions. He would sit across from his girlfriend at dinner, and she would talk about her day, excited or frustrated or whatever she was feeling, and he would nod and make appropriate sounds, but inside he felt nothing. He cared about her. Theoretically, he knew he should feel something, but the emotional connection was just gone. It was like trying to remember a dream. You know you had it, you know it meant something, but the actual content has completely evaporated. Here's what most people don't understand about emotional numbness. It's not a malfunction, it's a defense mechanism. Your mind is actually trying to protect you. Carl Jung understood this deeply. He believed that when the psyche encounters something, it cannot process something too painful, too overwhelming, too contradictory to your sense of self. It creates what he called a dissociative barrier, a wall between your conscious mind and your emotional experience. Numbness is your mind saying, "I cannot handle feeling this right now, so I will not feel anything at all." Think about it like this. If you touch a hot stove, your hand reflexively pulls away before you consciously decide to move. That's your nervous system protecting you from damage. Emotional numbness works the same way, except it's protecting you from psychological damage, from feelings that threaten to overwhelm your capacity to cope. Maybe you experienced something traumatic and the grief was too much. Maybe you've been disappointed so many times that hope became dangerous. Maybe you grew up in an environment where showing emotions was punished, so you learned to shut them down. Maybe you've been anxious for so long that your nervous system simply exhausted itself and shut off to conserve energy. Whatever the cause, numbness is not the problem. Numbness is a symptom. The problem is whatever made your mind decide that feeling was more dangerous than not feeling, and this is where it gets psychologically complex, because now you're trapped in a paradox. You can't heal from what you can't feel, but you can't feel because you haven't healed. It's like trying to open a door that's locked from the inside. You need to get in to unlock it, but you can't unlock it until you're inside. David started noticing other things too. His memory was becoming fuzzy, not in a dramatic way, but events would happen, and a week later, he could barely remember them. It was like his mind wasn't recording experiences anymore, because without emotional content, memories don't stick. You don't remember what happened, you remember how it made you feel, and if you felt nothing, there's nothing to anchor the memory to. He also noticed he was making decisions differently. Before he would weigh options based on what he wanted, what would make him happy, what aligned with his values. Now he made decisions based purely on logic, on what made sense, on what would cause the least disruption. Because he couldn't access the emotional compass that used to guide him, he was navigating life with half the instruments shut off. The problem with emotional numbness is that it doesn't discriminate. When your mind shuts down your capacity to feel pain, it also shuts down your capacity to feel joy. You can't selectively numb. You can't say, I want to feel the good things but not the bad things. It's all or nothing. It's like turning down the volume on your entire emotional radio. You don't just quiet the static, you also lose the music, and life without emotional texture is not really life at all. It's existence. It's going through the motions. It's surviving but not living. You become a ghost in your own life, present but not participating, visible but not really there. David would watch movies that used to make him cry and feel nothing. He would spend time with friends and go through the social choreography, perfectly laughing at jokes, participating in conversations, but inside, he was just performing the role of someone having a good time. He would achieve things at work, get praised, get promoted, and feel nothing, not satisfaction, not pride, not even relief. Just a vague recognition that something objectively positive had occurred, followed immediately by emptiness. And here's what makes numbness so existentially terrifying. When you can't feel, you start to question whether you even exist. Your emotions are proof of your aliveness. They're how you know you're real. They're what makes your experience yours. When they disappear, you start to feel like a philosophical zombie, going through the behavioral motions of being human, but lacking the internal subjective experience that makes those motions meaningful. Philosophers call this qualia, the internal subjective experience of consciousness, the what it's like to be you. When you're emotionally numb, you lose access to your own qualia. You can describe what's happening objectively, but you can't access what it feels like subjectively, and that disconnect is profoundly disturbing. Viktor Frankl, who survived Nazi concentration camps, wrote extensively about meaning and suffering. He said that suffering ceases to be suffering when it finds meaning, but what happens when you can't even suffer properly, when your capacity for emotional pain has been so thoroughly suppressed that you can't even access the suffering that might lead you to meaning? You're stuck in a liminal space, not suffering enough to be motivated to change, but not well enough to actually live. One of the cruelest aspects of emotional numbness is that you become exceptionally good at pretending you're okay because you're not actively suffering in obvious ways, because you're still functioning, still going through the motions. Everyone around you assumes you're fine, and after a while you become so skilled at performing normalcy that even you start to believe your own performance. You learn the scripts. You know that when someone shares good news, you're supposed to smile and say, "Congratulations," even though you feel nothing. You know that when someone is upset, you're supposed to look concerned and offer sympathy, even though you can't actually access empathy. You know how to laugh at jokes, how to look interested in conversations, how to mirror the appropriate emotional responses. And here's the thing, you're not being fake, you're not lying. These are genuinely the responses you would have if your emotional system was online. You remember how you used to react to these situations, so you recreate that reaction from memory, like an actor playing a role they've performed 1,000 times. David became a master of this performance. He knew exactly how long to maintain eye contact to seem engaged but not intense. He knew the right tone of voice to use when expressing concern. He knew how to modulate his facial expressions to match the emotional tenor of any situation, and people believed it. His girlfriend, his friends, his co-worker, none of them knew that inside he was running entirely on autopilot, that every emotional expression was a carefully executed simulation with no actual feeling behind it. But the performance was exhausting. Every social interaction became an acting job. Every conversation required him to consciously think about what he was supposed to be feeling and then express that feeling convincingly. And at the end of the day, when he was finally alone, he would collapse not from the social interaction itself, but from the constant effort of pretending to be emotionally present. And here's where it gets even more psychologically complex. After performing emotions long enough without actually feeling them, you start to forget what genuine emotion even feels like. You lose the ability to distinguish between authentic feeling and performed feeling. You become so disconnected from your internal experience that you're no longer sure if you've ever actually felt anything, or if your entire emotional life has always been a performance, socially acceptable simulation with no real core. David's emotional numbness didn't come from nowhere. Even though he couldn't identify a single traumatic event that caused it, there was no dramatic loss, no obvious trauma, no clear breaking point. But that's the thing about emotional shutdown. It doesn't always come from one big thing. Sometimes it comes from 1,000 small things, an accumulation of micro-abandonments, minor betrayals, subtle invalidations that your conscious mind dismissed as no big deal, but your unconscious mind kept score of. Every time he shared something vulnerable and the other person changed the subject, every time he was excited about something and someone responded with indifference, every time he needed support and was told to just deal with it, every time he expressed a feeling and was told he was being too sensitive, too dramatic, too much, each one was a small message. Feelings are not safe. Feelings are not welcome. Feelings will not be reciprocated. And after enough of these messages, his mind made a logical, feelings will not be reciprocated. And after enough of these messages, his mind made a logical feelings decision. If feelings lead to disappointment, rejection, invalidation, then the safest course of action is to stop having them. Jung called this the wounded inner child, the part of us that experienced emotional pain early in life and never fully healed. That wound doesn't go away, it just gets buried, and the scar tissue forms around it. And that scar tissue is numbness. But here's what makes this so hard to address. You can't heal what you can't access, and numbness specifically prevents you from accessing the wound. It's like trying to treat an infection that's deep under layers of protective tissue. You know something's wrong, but you can't reach it to clean it out. Trauma therapists understand this. They know that before you can process trauma, you have to restore the capacity to feel, and that's terrible. terrifying, because the numbness exists precisely to prevent you from feeling. If you start to feel again, you'll feel everything: the pain you've been avoiding, the grief you've been suppressing, the rage you've been denying, the fear you've been ignoring. Your mind knows this, and it resists. It will fight to maintain the numbness, because from its perspective, numbness kept you alive, kept you functional, kept you from falling apart completely. The breaking point came unexpectedly for David. Not dramatically, but quietly. He was at his nephew's birthday party, a completely mundane situation, watching this kid who was turning 6 open presents and shriek with delight at a toy dinosaur, and something in that moment cracked. He didn't cry. He didn't have a breakdown. He just stood there watching this child experience pure, uncomplicated joy over something so simple, and he realized with devastating clarity, I can't remember the last time I felt that. I can't remember what that feels like. And for the first time in years, that realization hurt. Not the numbness itself, but the awareness of what the numbness had taken from him. It was like a patient who has been given anesthesia for so long, they forgot they were supposed to be able to feel pain, and then suddenly the anesthesia starts to wear off, and the first sensation is not relief, it's agony, because now you're aware of everything you've been missing, everything that's been hurt, everything that hasn't healed. Nietzsche wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how," but he also understood that sometimes you need to experience the full weight of your suffering before you can find your way through it. You can't transcend what you haven't acknowledged. You can't overcome what you refuse to feel. And David had been refusing to feel for so long that he'd forgotten he was refusing it, had become so automatic, so habitual, that the numbness felt like his natural state. But now, watching his nephew, he remembered there was another way to be. There was a version of him that could feel genuine excitement, uncomplicated happiness, simple joy without the constant emotional flatline, and he wanted that back. He didn't know how to get it back, but for the first time in years, he wanted something, and wanting is a feeling. Wanting is proof that the emotional system isn't completely dead, it's just dormant, and dormant things can be awakened, but waking up is not comfortable. It's not a gentle process. It's not like opening your eyes on a peaceful morning. It's like regaining consciousness after trauma. It's disorienting, it's painful, it's overwhelming, and every instinct will tell you to go back to sleep, to return to the numbness, because at least numbness doesn't hurt, but you can't live there forever. Eventually you have to choose. Do you want to be safe, or do you want to be alive? Deciding to feel again is not the same as actually feeling again. You don't just flip a switch and suddenly have access to your emotions again. The numbness has been your default operating system for so long that your brain has literally rewired itself around it. Neuroscience shows that when you suppress emotions chronically, your brain reduces the neural pathways associated with emotional processing. It's not permanent, but it requires intentional work to rebuild those pathways. David started with something simple. He started naming what he was supposed to be feeling, not what he actually felt, because he still couldn't access that, but what logic dictated he should be feeling. I'm having dinner with my girlfriend. I should feel connected right now, but I feel nothing. Okay, that's information. I'm getting a compliment at work. I should feel proud, but I feel nothing. That's data. I'm watching a sunset that's supposed to be beautiful. I should feel something, but I don't. Okay, I'm noticing this pattern, and here's what's important about this practice. He wasn't trying to force the feelings. He wasn't beating himself up for not feeling. He was simply creating awareness, bringing conscious attention to the gap between what he logically knew he should feel and what he actually felt. Because awareness is always the first step. You can't change what you're not aware of. Slowly, very slowly, he started to notice tiny flickers, not full emotions but hints, whispers, a moment where a song gave him just a slight feeling. Not enjoyment, exactly, but less, nothing than usual. A conversation where he felt a small spark of interest, not engagement, exactly, but less emptiness than normal. These weren't breakthroughs, they were barely perceptible shifts, but he learned to notice them, to acknowledge them, to not dismiss them as insignificant, because they weren't insignificant. They were the first signs that his emotional system was still there, just buried, and it could be excavated, one tiny sensation at a time. He also started doing something that felt ridiculous. At first, he started practicing feeling in controlled ways, watching movies specifically chosen to evoke emotion, not trying to feel, but giving himself permission to feel, if it happened, listening to music from periods in his life when he could still feel, trying to access emotional memory, even if the present was still numb, writing about his emotional numbness itself, because even numbness is a feeling of sorts. It's a feeling of not feeling, and putting that into words was a way of reconnecting with his internal experience. As David slowly started to regain access to his emotions, something unexpected happened. The numbness started to lift. He began to feel again, and the first thing he felt was grief, profound, overwhelming grief for everything he had missed, for the years he had spent in emotional autopilot, for the relationships he had maintained but never really experienced, for the moments of beauty and connection that had passed by while he was locked inside himself. And underneath that grief was anger. Anger at the world that had taught him feelings were dangerous. Anger at the people who had invalidated his emotions until he learned to invalidate them himself. Anger at himself for letting it go on so long, for not fighting harder to stay connected to his own internal experience. And underneath the anger was fear, the fear that had been there all along. The fear that made the numbness necessary in the first place, the fear of being hurt, of being rejected, of feeling too much and being too much, of opening himself up and having that openness exploited, of being vulnerable and having that vulnerability weaponized against him. The numbness, Jung would say, was protecting his wounded inner self from further injury. It was a psychological immune response, treating all emotional experience as a potential threat and shutting down the entire system to prevent infection. But immune responses can become autoimmune when the protection system starts attacking healthy cells along with harmful ones. When you shut down all feeling to protect yourself from painful feeling, you also destroy the capacity for meaning, for connection, for aliveness. And now that the numbness was lifting, David had to face what it had been protecting him from. He had to feel the old wounds that had never healed, the accumulated disappointments, the suppressed grief, the denied anger. All of it came flooding back, and it was exactly as overwhelming as his mind had feared it would be, exactly as painful as the numbness had been designed to prevent. But here's the crucial difference. Now he had awareness. Now he understood what was happening. Now he could process these feelings instead of being blindsided by them. Now he could grieve consciously instead of suppressing unconsciously. Now he could be angry with purpose instead of turning that anger inward into numbness. And slowly, through feeling all the feelings he had avoided, he began to discover something on the other side of the pain. 6 months after the birthday party that cracked something open, David was not cured. He was not suddenly joyful and emotionally available and living his best life. Recovery doesn't work that way. But he was different, fundamentally different. He could feel again, not all the time, not consistently, not without effort, but he could feel. And once you remember what feeling feels like, once you've tasted aliveness again, even in small doses, you can't go back to complete numbness, the same way the contrast is too stark. The emptiness is too obvious. He noticed it in small things. A conversation with his girlfriend where he actually felt connected, where he wasn't performing interest, but genuinely experiencing it. A moment at work where he felt actual satisfaction, not performed pride, but real internal sense of accomplishment. A sunset that made him stop and look, really look and feel something he couldn't quite name, but something that felt like beauty or wonder, or at least the beginning of those feelings. And yes, he still had days where the numbness returned, where he felt himself starting to shut down again, where old protective patterns tried to reassert themselves, but now he recognized it. Now he had tools. Now he understood that numbness was a signal, not a permanent state, that when his emotions started to flatten, it meant something was wrong, something needed attention, something was triggering his old protective mechanisms, and he could intervene. Jung taught that the goal of psychological development is not happiness but wholeness, not the absence of suffering, but the integration of all parts of yourself, including the parts that hurt, including the capacity to feel pain, because without that capacity, you also lose the capacity for genuine joy, for deep connection, for authentic meaning. David was learning to be whole, which meant learning to be vulnerable again, learning to feel without the guarantee that those feelings would be pleasant, learning to open himself to experience, knowing that some of those experiences would hurt, but understanding that the hurt was proof he was alive, and alive was better than safe, alive was better than numb, alive was better than the half-existence of emotional shutdown. He still had work to do. He was still rebuilding, still learning, still discovering parts of himself that had been dormant for years, but he was no longer empty. He was no longer a ghost in his own life. He was here, present, feeling imperfect but real. And for the first time in years, when someone asked him, "How are you doing?" his answer wasn't fine. It was, "I'm feeling things again." And that's harder than I expected, but also better, because feeling things, even painful things, means I'm alive. And being alive is terrifying and beautiful and overwhelming, and exactly what I need.